Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 124, To Gender or Not to Gender, with Margaret Oakes. For many different reasons, questions of gender casting have followed Shakespeare's plays, if not since their inception, thanks to the prohibitions of women performing on stage, then from the Restoration onwards. Those conversations have become very prominent in the last 20 years or so, as ideas about gender identity have become much more fluid. I recently got the chance to read a new book on the subject called To Gender or Not to Gender, Casting and Characters for 21st Century Shakespeare, by Margaret Oakes, who, I'm pleased to say, agreed to talk to me about the book, which explores ways in which gender is being reinterpreted by British and North American productions since the turn of the millennium. After an initial chapter outlining recent gender theory, which is very useful to a newcomer to this as an academic subject like myself, the rest of the book uses examples of recent productions to illustrate different possibilities in cross-gender casting, and the questions that this approach can lead to. I found it to be an absolutely fascinating read, driven by Margaret's enthusiasm for her subject, which you can also hear in our conversation. Margaret J. Oakes is a professor of English at Furman University, a liberal arts college in Greenville, South Carolina. She specialises in early modern British poetry and drama and detective fiction. She holds a BA in English and a J.D. from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, an MA in English from Northwestern University, and a Ph.D. in English and Humanities from Stanford University. She's published on George Herbert, Francis Bacon, J.K. Rowling, Sara Paretsky, and Dorothy L Sayers. I spoke to Margaret from her home in South Carolina over Zoom and started by asking her why she'd decided to write about cross-gender casting in Shakespeare at this point in time, and how she went about her research.
So I was in the UK for several months in 2018 with some students, and part of our goal was to see a lot of theater. I think we saw 16 plays that fall. And it just so happened this kept coming up. So I would see Troilus and Cressida, and Adjoa Ando is playing Ulysses. And we saw Romeo and Juliet, and Charlie Josephine is playing Mercutio. And so I'm watching people do this. And as I accumulated those experiences in my mind, I thought, okay, when did that work? When did that not work? Why? How did the audience react? Why? And that sort of gets into how we as audience members think about what we're seeing on stage. And then I was interested in how the theater critics are reacting and why. So it all kind of spiraled back from actually watching some productions. And then I discovered some other, that was a very rich time, slightly pre-pandemic, very rich time in British theater for engaging in these kinds of experiments. I learned about other productions around the same time that I had not seen, that I was able to talk to people about or see filmed. And it just the same questions coming up over and over again. And I think that's how you know you've got something, is when you see the questions and you see a lot of interesting answers to those questions and figuring out why those answers are different. And over time, part of my argument is over time, we look at performance history, and the way we look at a play changes. The way we look at a script changes. The way we look at actors changes. And I tracked that for about 20 or so years. And just some incredibly rapid, extraordinary changes in all of those things in some British and some North American productions. And, I'm going to, maybe we should talk about this later, but I'm going to start thinking about some continental productions as well. But I just had a limited scope, as one has to do in an academic study for this book.
And how about the process of actually getting to talk to people about why they were doing that?
Yeah, this was thanks to the pandemic entirely.
Right.
So I begin the process. I write a research grant. I have a research assistant. COVID hits. Academic libraries were not open. They were not lending books. I could not see my research assistant in person. So, okay, what am I going to do? So I thought to myself, hey, I also know, because I know a lot of actors, they're not working. So I thought, hey, let's just start emailing. So I put my assistant on the task of And this was also an interesting process. Who do you talk to? Who's their agent? How do you find somebody?
Right.
And I was able to talk to the director of a production of Othello, that was very interesting. And then Charlie Josephine, the actor I mentioned a few minutes ago, who actually was in a very, very important production of Henry IV, where Harriet Walter starred as Henry IV, and it was an all-female production.
Yes.
A very famous trilogy in the early 2000s, done by Phillida Lloyd. So Charlie Josephine had been involved in a couple of these sorts of interesting productions. So talking to them was also crucial. I also have a few contacts in the States, someone who's a stage manager who's also gay. And so getting his perspective on working with the actors and how the audiences see things. And then a woman I know who has played Jaques in As You Like It, and a couple of other parts, cross-sex parts. So it was just really the pandemic just made this possible. And that was also helpful because a lot of productions, the Royal National Theatre and the RSC and other theaters put stuff on film and made it available streaming. And that was just sort of a blessing because, and that they still do, it's by subscription. You can buy a subscription, your school library can buy a subscription. So really we have so much more access to things now, just completely accidentally. So it was, the pandemic was great for me in some respects, because I was able to do that. And I, it's difficult to do this kind of research because plays are ephemeral, right? Unless you happen to get that one film production, there's a great film production of David Tennant and Richard II from the RSC, very famous production from 2013, right? We have access to these things, and that is happening a little bit more now. So we can see theater performance without having to go through or compare your experience with the theater critic's experience. And that's actually been very, very enlightening for me because I think to myself, I'm not seeing that way at all as that person saw it. So it was sort of a combination of things, serendipitous, a confluence of events.
Making the best of what was overall a terrible situation.
Yeah, that's right.
But that gave you the opportunity to talk, presumably in some depth, to actors, and you could discuss with them how they were interpreting these roles.
Yeah. And also, reading interviews, also some actors were doing some writing, some even on the internet. Michelle Terry, who is the artistic director for the RSC, for the Globe, and is currently starring in Richard III with some controversy for other reasons. But she did a Hamlet herself, and she's done other things. So there's just a lot more material available, and even things from the actors themselves. So that's very helpful.
Yeah. But as you say in your book, in fact, you introduce your book by showing that historically, since the resumption of theatre at the Restoration, there's been a long tradition of casting actresses into leading Shakespearean male roles. So I was wondering if you could give us a few examples of those, and particularly ones that maybe had some significant impact.
Yeah. And so this is a good example, Philip, because we sort of pick and choose what we want to evaluate in terms of acting. So in the late 18th century, 19th century, you're seeing actors like Charlotte Shark, Sarah Siddons, and these were sort of novelty roles. And to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes it's let's put the actress in something where we can see her legs. I mean, that was some of it, to be breeches parts, they call them.
Yes.
Right. And that's, As You Like It is an attractive play for some people because you can see the actress's legs, obviously not a big deal now. So some of these are just novelties, and you see that reflected in some of the responses. We do have some critical responses. There are some that are a little more thoughtful and saying, yes, the actress is showing these elements of of Hamlet's character. Hamlet is an interesting character because in the late 18th and 19th century, he is pictured as what I'm going to very inaccurately call effeminate. He's whiny, he's weepy, he's petulant, all of these things that we tend to associate with, traditionally have been associated with sort of feminine behavior. So if you're looking at it that way, then you can cast a woman and say, oh, she can do that better because she's female. Sarah Bernhardt very famously played Hamlet. And this is what I'm saying, we pick and choose. She was 52 and had one leg at the time. So, Hamlet is a funny script because it actually has some contradictory information about his age. Is he sort of a graduate student or college student at Wittenberg? And there's other instances that says he's sort of older and fat. So we don't really know how old Hamlet is. He is not in any situation 52. And he has both of his legs, as far as I've ever. So, but the great Sara Bernhardt, because she is the great Sara Bernhardt, can do that. And that was a bit of a set piece for her. I'm not sure how they handled the leg situation, to be perfectly honest. But, now Ian McKellen just played Hamlet.
Yes.
A year and a half ago. The man is 83 years old. So, and by the way, another variable, Ian McKellen is gay. Do we expect a young straight actor to play Hamlet? Can we have an 83-year-old gay actor playing Hamlet? So what I'm saying is when we say, oh, so-and-so can't do that because they're male or female, we ignore those kinds of things all the time when we want to. So we did this for Hamlet for a long time. And I would say these characters, these castings tended to die down in the early 20s, early 20th century. I think partly because there was sort of an increase in psychological realism in theater. Ibsen, we have characters who we want to get in their heads and see what they're thinking and have it be very realistic on stage. And some of the novelty casting kind of dropped out, maybe because of that. And then, you get Olivier in the 50s, very macho Hamlet. Maybe it was 48, I don't know, but very, manly Hamlet. And so what an actor does changes the public's perception of what that character is, sometimes I would say permanently, but very effectively for a long time, right? We have very strong feelings about the character, not because we've read it, but we've seen somebody do that, and we think that's how it should be. But we know that about Hamlet. So that's a character that changes a lot, and I think people are more accepting of that because we've seen it change. Prospero also, there's a couple of reasons for this. So who's hard to crosscast? Let's start with that. Historical figures can be, because the plot has to make sense, but there's some exceptions to that. Prospero has no historical antecedent. He's old, doesn't fight with anyone. There's no kind of physical conflict that you'd have to deal with.
Right.
And the parental relationship, people really clearly want to explore that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of women cast as Prospero, or they resex the character as a mother, as Prospera. And that's wonderful, because then you get all kinds of, this is what I was saying. How does it affect the play? If Prospera is the Duchess of Milan, then you get some interesting things in what happens to her relationship with her brother. And the fact that she's been engaging in magic, well, all of a sudden she becomes a witch, and there's that whole right. So there are some cool things you can do with that change.
Yeah.
And people are continuing to explore that, but so the point is, it's not just a novelty change anymore. It's, wow, this can raise some really interesting possibilities for new questions to ask and new ways to talk about the character. I know there have been some very poor, Francis de la Tour did a Hamlet that was not well received. There have been some female Lears on and off that have been received various ways, Glenda Jackson, Catherine Hunter. But the question really to me is, what can you do with that in the script? And can you do some interesting things with that? And that's what my actors and directors told me. I mean, Charlie Josephine says, if you're raising new questions for the audience, job done. That was exactly how she put it. So what are you doing? But it's got to be audience perception. If the audience doesn't see it, then there's no point to it. If it's just in the actor's mind, that may be interesting, but it's not going to come across the audience. So there's kind of two layers of questions here. What can you do, and how will it be perceived by the audience?
So casting across gender lines isn't new, but in the last decade or so, the concept of gender has become much less binary and more nuanced. And how has that affected the way theatres and actors and directors are approaching casting, in your view?
So I'm gonna raise two examples here. The first one is someone I did not get to talk to, although I tried. So I was working on this in 2020, and I ran across this performance in 2018 of Othello at the Liverpool Everyman Theatre, directed by Gemma Bowden. It's starring, and you'll see when I say this name, you're gonna understand it, starring Golda Rochevelle. So I'd never heard of her before because Bridgerton came out about 6 months later. So we tried to reach Golda Rochevelle and got no response. And later I knew why, but at the time I did not know why. She's a very experienced Shakespearean actor.
Indeed.
But I did talk to Gemma Bodnitz about this production. So Golda Rochevelle played Othello as a lesbian. Again, this opens up, see, I'm watching your eyes pop. Like the relationship she has with Iago suddenly becomes much more interesting, much clearer in some respects. The fact that Brabantio is so angry at Desdemona. So the backstory of this, Gemma told me, was that Desdemona is straight until she meets Othello. So this is this huge change in Brabantio's thinking about his daughter. They also had Rochevelle wearing dresses at some points in the play. So it wasn't like she was this, stereotypical butch, lesbian person. So sometimes when she's doing military things, she's in military gear. And when she's not, she's not. So again, it raises interesting new questions. There's also, Desdemona is, I forgot if she's strangled or suffocated, but it's not something that a woman could not do. There's a little bit of physical conflict, nothing that would look ridiculous for a woman to be engaging in. In fact, most of the fighting is by the other men in the play, Rodrigo and Cassio. So that all worked out in a very interesting way and got some interesting questions out on the table for the audience. It was a very well received production. There've not been other Othellos that I could find, although I'm sure somebody's done that somewhere. The other one I want to talk about is Shubham Saraf with Michelle Terry in a 2018 production of Hamlet at the Globe, where Shubham Saraf played Ophelia in a dress, did not make any attempt to look female. I think there were female gendered pronouns. He's not a very big person. But it's that's an interesting one for the audience. How does the audience perceive this person? How do they perceive that relationship? But he said, we just didn't want to pretend I was female or have it be, because here's the problem. When you have a man in women's dress, and I discussed this elsewhere in the book and with Charlie Josephine, especially in UK, it's Panto or it's Monty Python, right? And it automatically becomes funny. So I want to go back to the very famous production in 2002, 2011 in New York, 2012, Mark Rylance and Paul Chahidi in Twelfth Night. It's hilarious. And it's because they're playing parody women. They're in kind of white face makeup, and Mark Rylance, who has sort of a high voice, is kind of doing this higher voice. And they have this way of moving around the stage where they learn to take little tiny steps under the dresses so it looks like they're gliding. One critic said they look like a Dalek, a Doctor Who, just like zooming around the stage like this. Yeah. So when men are playing women, the first reaction is to go like there, because that's easier than doing it in a realistic way. Right? The parody is much easier. So Shubham Saraf said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to play a character with these personality characteristics. And you can perceive that as it's a person being this way. It doesn't have to be labeled as masculine or feminine, because that doesn't actually make any sense. So it's making people question why we have categories of masculine and feminine. Why do we even do that? And the thing I kind of joke about in the book is, well, women are, they're artistic and they think about music and I said, well, so did Waylon Jennings, but nobody thought he was feminine. So again, we pick and choose how we apply these definitions. And I love these productions that kind of poke on that. As much as I love that 12th Night, it in some ways it's not very experimental. And experimental isn't always good, but it just goes kind of to the easy place. And I think the difference now is a little bit later, people are kind of going toward the more interesting, slightly murkier places. And that makes, I think, for a good production. And that's why we can still watch this and say, this isn't irrelevant. Shakespeare has no stage directions. He has very little description of his characters. It's a blank canvas in so many fun ways. So you can really take advantage of that and still, I think, stay honest with the script.
Yeah. And you make the point in the book that this has come so far that we're now not saying being surprised about an actress taking a male part, but that we are saying, well, how good is Tamsin Gregg's Malvolio or whichever one it is? Amazing. Which was a very good one, as it happens.
That is one of the I'm a huge fan of Daniel Rigby, who plays Andrew Aguecheek in that production, and I'm a huge fan of Oliver Chris. So that's just a wonderful cast entirely.
Yeah, both playing to comic strengths in
yes.
Yeah.
That's right. But I just want to say too, David Tennant's Richard II, excuse me. And another one, 2000 production of Richard II, where the actor is clearly doing an older Elizabeth I, the kind of white makeup and the red wig.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to think about Richard II, very much into artifice in their self-presentation. And these two actors have actually done a little talk back together about their different perceptions of the character. Like, is Richard always acting? I think there's some argument for that. When is Richard ever actually himself? Is he always acting like how he thinks a king should act? And David Tennant was a little bit different in presenting that, but he had hair extensions down to his waist. He had different clothing than the other men in the play, and he had gold fingernails. And he said, we just thought he did that because Richard would do whatever he wanted. And that's part of his personality, is just doing whatever he wants. And that's part of the problem, is that he does whatever he wants. So again, is that a male or female behavior? Or is that just like somebody being a very, very ineffective king? And they you can go into the historical questions about Richard and his relationship with, Piers Gaveston or not. But again, the question is, why do we think things are masculine or feminine? Why do we attach those labels? How can you show those questions on stage?
And all of that kind of does play back into the thing that we praise Shakespeare perhaps most for, is that he creates believable individual characters.
Yeah.
Individuals that also manage to represent the whole.
Yes. Yes. I think he, maybe more so than some other playwrights of his time, plays better into our notions of psychological realism. In fact, I think he couldn't help himself. He wrote characters that were too good sometimes. And it enables us to ask these questions. Other plays, I think, at the time, and you asked me about this too, I think are harder to do some of this with. But I think we both have an interest in early modern acting style, which is completely different from what we expect on stage now. But I think Shakespeare's more adaptable to our current expectations of acting styles than maybe Marlowe, who I love, but who had like no sense of humor, really. So yeah, I think he's a great playwright, but he's just different from other people of his time, I think.
I think I'm right in saying we haven't seen cross-gender casting in other playwrights' work from around the same period.
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked me that question, because that really kind of kept me up a couple of nights in a good way. So I was thinking about this, and I did not, to be honest, do any research on that, but I will. Who has done things? But I was thinking first, you couldn't really cross-cast Tamburlaine. Then I thought, why not? When I think about Joa Ando, her 2019 Richard II at the Sam Wanamaker Theater, It was an all-female, all women of color cast and production crew. Again, this is slightly before Bridgerton. But I mean, if you've seen Bridgerton, you know how Lady Danbury sort of commands the room. Joe Ando can just command a room.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I thought, well, yeah, why couldn't Tamburlaine be female? That would be an astounding kind of production. I mean, so yeah, here's the question. Does the plot sort of say no? 'Tis pity she's a whore. I mean, the plot requires people to be of particular sex because somebody gets pregnant. So there's some things that just may not work too well. Arden of Faversham, for instance, maybe not. So I think, again, will the plot let it work? And if so, we should kind of give it a try, again, to start pressing on those questions of power, of family relationships. I mean, Tamburlaine, especially the second one, is all about family relationships and grief. Tamburlaine, the second part's all about grief. Yeah. I mean, he's toting his wife's body around, for heaven's sake. And that, there's nothing to say that could not be a cross-sex cast. So, yeah, I think there's some great possibilities there with certain plays.
Yeah. Well, watch with interest. And we've talked a lot about females playing male roles particularly, but are there any other examples of cross-casting that you came across?
So you can cast me as a male character, or you can rewrite the character to be female for me. So there's two things you can do. And people have done both. And sometimes one works better than the other. And sometimes I said it makes no difference. So I mentioned Charlie Josephine in Romeo and Juliet. She played Mercutio, as did Golda Rochebelle in a production about a year before, which was a weird production that did not get excellent reviews. So I saw Charlie Josephine on stage. They were wearing pants and sort of a nondescript sort of top. And Mercutio, is this very brash, loud character, gets in fights. It actually has has a lot of lines, given that he dies fairly early in the play. And it's very rude to people and whatnot. Just as behavior, I don't think we would question that in a woman nowadays. So the character, I did not realize this while I was watching it, was supposed to be female. I did not realize that until I went home and looked at the program and they had female pronouns. I thought Charlie Josephine is playing a male character because here's the thing, as I mentioned with Mercutio, it makes no difference. Mercutio could be male or female. It doesn't matter. And that's not a bad thing. That just tells you how we think differently about potential female behavior. Okay. I thought she was great. The character was great. I thought Charlie was great. They were happy with that production as I interviewed them about it. But what I loved about that production was a smaller thing. Romeo's parents' lines were switched at the end of the play. And this completely changed the way I think about Romeo and Juliet, which I traditionally have not liked. And I don't think they should let 14-year-olds read it in high school because it's terrible. People committing suicide. So Romeo's, in the play, in the script, Romeo's mother dies of grief.
Right.
And Romeo's father has a few lines to talk about that at the end. So in this production, they had Romeo's father dying of grief. And Romeo's mother is at the end of the play is out on stage talking about how she's lost her son and now lost her husband. And all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, this is a woman in early modern Italian culture who has no male protector now. She is alone in this culture, and that is very bad. And then you start to realize what this whole play is about is actually civic unrest. What happens when these two families who are supposed to be leading families in town basically blow up and everybody starts killing each other and the whole town, just a bomb explodes in the town. And there's several instances where I don't know if it's a duke or it's count or whatever it is, the ruler of the town, who was played by a woman, comes out and says, we all need to calm down, whatever. And that kind of gets pushed aside in productions of Romeo and Juliet. But I thought this is actually that these two kids have created a a ripple effect of destruction in this town because of their unintended consequences of their behavior. And the whole town has fallen apart. It's a play about civic unrest. And I saw that because I understood what the consequences were for this woman when she lost the male members of her family. That was huge to me. And I will say some critics didn't get that. They didn't see that at all. So that was maybe just me. But I understand, and maybe because I know the play better than some viewers, I don't know. But that was a beautiful change to me. And again, it was just switching a few lines. That's all it was. So that's a director and an artistic director, and the actors are reading the play very carefully and understanding the nuances of changing some things and how that works within the entire context of the play. Because if you do something here and it doesn't match up with something there, or it contradicts something back there, it's all connected to each other. And you have to say, if we're going to change this, then how does it change that? And how does it change that character? And how does it change that scenario and that conversation? So these are actually very tricky things to do well, but people are being careful about that now and not just going, oh, cast the girl and see what happens. That's so funny. So yeah, I think it produces careful readings and that's what's valuable about it. Again, we can really do things with these scripts that, who would have thought there'd be new things to do with these scripts?
After we finished recording, Margaret was keen to add that most of all, she would encourage us to go and see Shakespeare productions with an open mind, to discover how Shakespeare can be interpreted and understood. Any degree of interpretation is made possible because we know so little of the original settings of the plays, which might be considered the correct way to do Shakespeare, and even less, indeed, nothing about what Shakespeare's own views were. He presents such a breadth of characters and different opinions in his plays that we cannot detect the man himself in them, and thus we're left to interpret them for our own time and situation. Sentiments I can heartily endorse. By happy coincidence, To Gender or Not to Gender by Margaret Oakes is published on the day this episode is released, July the 1st, 2024, and is available from online booksellers, your local good bookshop, and direct from the publishers Macfarlane. I've put links in the show notes and on the guest page of the website. And next time, it's on with the plays and Henry VI, Part 1. In the meantime, don't forget the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. And then, if you would like some more theatre history and are able to help contribute to the costs of running the podcast, there is the offering on Patreon for a small monthly fee. You can find all these details at the podcast website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.